Afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar with the wonderful Claire Coates and Helen Bethell from Griffydam Primary School. I hope you've all managed to get back to the staff room before joining us and you've got a cup of tea in hand. As a former teacher, I appreciate the importance of a post-pickup cup of tea, so I hope you've got that. So my name is Tori and I'll be hosting this afternoon's webinar. And before joining Century 3.5 years ago, I was a primary school teacher in London, and I'm now the primary lead. And my role at Century is to create a lot of the primary content. And I also work with schools to help them launch Century successfully. We're also joined today by my amazing colleague, Nikki Willis, who is Griffydam's account manager. And our account managers work very closely with our schools to ensure that they are able to get the most out of the platform. Now, when it comes to introducing new EdTech in schools, there are so many things to think about. The world of EdTech has really taken off in the last 10 years and accelerated even more so since the start of the pandemic. There are so many new products out there, which is definitely a good thing. But deciding what's right for your school can be a real challenge, and there are many things to consider. So first of all, what problems will it actually solve? Do you have the right infrastructure in place? How will it be implemented and embedded within teaching and learning, especially if some members of staff may be reluctant to adopt new technologies? But most importantly, how will you measure the impact? And how will you know if it's been a worthwhile investment? So this afternoon, we're going to hear from Claire and Helen about their journey with Century and the impact that it's having on teaching and learning within their school. So Claire Coates is the head teacher of Griffydam School and also head of their sister school, Moira Primary. And Helen Bethell is assistant head and English and maths lead at Griffydam. Now, if anybody has any questions for either Claire or Helen, please do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them at the end. But before handing over to Claire and Helen, we're just going to hear from my colleague Nikki, who's Griffydam's account manager. She's briefly going to share some of Griffydam's usage statistics just to set the scene. And then Nikki is also going to be speaking towards the end of the webinar to explain a little bit more about her role as an account manager and the support that we offer to schools. So over to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Tori. As Tori said, my name's Nikki. I'm an account manager at Century and work to support primary schools specifically. I have the pleasure of working with Griffydam Primary School, who you'll hear from shortly. But before I hand over to Claire and Helen, I will briefly just be showing you the journey that Griffydam Primary School have taken through Century so far by showing a little bit of the data that we've gathered, which tells a little bit of a story about how things have been going so far and give a bit of an insight as well into the kind of data that we share with you. So next slide. Oh, there we go. It's already up there. Cool. So the first thing that we're looking at here is the entire history of usage on Century for Griffydam. The pattern on the graph indicates a few things. Firstly, you can see the big spike there at the start of 2021, which correlates perfectly with lockdown number 3. I hope this isn't bringing up too many bad memories for teachers out there, as everyone was home learning between January and March of that time. So as you can see, Griffydam were using Century to support their home learning during that time. But I think what is actually more interesting about this though, this graph, is that we can see that usage has generally kept up really well, even when back in the classroom, which is a really good indicator of excellent embedding of Century into general teaching practice, and also shows that they've had a focused long-term plan for Century, and yeah, brilliant to see such consistent use. So yeah, to show this data in a slightly different way now, I'm going to show you some of the quantifiable numbers behind that graph. So next slide, please. This is the work that has been completed by students in that time. We can see here that 180,000 questions have been answered and almost 30,000 nuggets have been completed. For anyone who doesn't know, nugget is the word that we use for our micro lessons on Century. And just to put those numbers into context, there's averagely around 65 students using Century at Griffydam at any one time. So of course, there's been a turnover of students during that time, but it does work out to around 450 nuggets per student, which is really quite a lot of work and a testament to Claire and Helen's approach with Century for sure. The last metric on there is the 4,000 nuggets completed from the pathway. The pathway is a really brilliant way for students to learn independently and are recommended to students through Century's AI and are always tailored specifically to that student's gap in knowledge. So an excellent indication of independent learning as well. Next slide, please. So independent learning is something that we've been it's come up in discussions with Claire and Helen and is, promoting a sense of agency and pushing students to become independent learners is an important focal point. And that really does come through in this data here. So what we're looking at is that of the 65 students that have logged in the last 3 months, 54 of them, which is just over 80%, engage with their student dashboard, which is like the student dashboard is built to encourage students to reflect on their learning. It shows them their strengths and weaknesses and suggests nuggets to complete that will help improve those weaknesses. So this is a really good indicator that Claire and Helen's students are becoming the independent learners as per their intention. Next slide, please. So Century also gives students the opportunity to reflect on their emotions. There's a little icon asking students, how are you feeling today? Which the students can click and register their response at any time, and also pops up when the students complete a nugget. So it's really nice to see that the emotion registered most frequently is happy, followed by proud. So clearly the students really love learning on Century, which is brilliant to see. And I thought quite a cheerful stat to finish on as well. So having seen a little bit of that data, which takes us on a little journey about how things have been progressing and shows how successfully Century has been embedded as well, I'm delighted to hand over to Claire and Helen, who will talk you through a little bit more detail about how they've done this in practice. So Claire and Helen, over to you.
My name's Claire Coates. I'm head teacher here at Griffydam. I've been here for 5 years. Griffydam is a very rural school in northwest Leicestershire. We are quite unique in that we have a very small catchment usually, so most children who come to our school want to come here and come from the surrounding area and the surrounding towns and villages, which makes for quite an interesting cohort and very variable in terms of their need and their demographic. So it is a lovely place to work and yeah, full of challenges and very, very close-knit and all of those sorts of things that you think about when it comes to a rural school. Got very low levels of pupil premium and around average levels of SEND. So here's some pictures of my school. So as you can see, the children are very happy and very content. We love a bit of creativity and we are definitely into our physical activity and really thinking about the whole child. So with that in mind, why is a school like ours benefiting from Century, an online platform? Wow. Century was something that was introduced to me when I visited the Youth Sport Trust Conference in February 2020, and I saw Priya, the CEO, speak about Century and AI, and it really did pique my interest because at that point we hadn't shut down, but we were considering ways in which we could be much more responsive to pupil needs. At that point, we didn't know that the world was going to change massively. And so kind of Century just went on the back burner. And then, as you know, COVID happened and everything went up in the air. And at that point, that talk about recovery really did come to the fore. And our thoughts as a senior leadership team here at Griffydam thought about actually what is it that we need in order to really make our children successful, enable them to re-engage with learning and be part of that learning process and that learning journey. We wanted something that was sustainable. We wanted something that was responsive and high quality, but also meaningful, because I think that what we felt as a school is that there were lots of initiatives that were being thrown at us from here, there and everywhere, and we couldn't see that longer term benefit. So Century was dug out as one of the tools, and it really did hit many of those points really, really well. It was responsive. It was something that children could use at home or in school, which was really, really important. It was incredibly flexible. And I know that we talk about artificial intelligence, and that's something that was quite meaningless to me to start with. But actually, if we're looking at a personalised learning agenda, then that's something that Century does really, really well. And it was something that children could really engage with and found enjoyable to access. So there were our reasons why. But what did we do? So our first job was introducing Century into our school with the staff. And I'm going to put up some of the questions that the staff had, because if you're thinking about using Century in your school, your staff will probably have the same questions. So the first one, will children engage? The first thought of our staff was really around the fact that children had had so much screen time. What were they doing? What were we doing? Getting another bit of tech for them at this point. We quickly found that actually Century was fantastic at pupil engagement. The nuggets are really, really small, really, really easy to access and link really clearly to where the children's needs are. So there was no worries that the children wouldn't engage. And you've seen from our graph, actually, it's something that children sustain engagement with because the content grows as the curriculum grows. It's something that will engage our most able to our less able equally well. And I think that's one of the real benefits of Century. The next question, will it make a difference? We weren't sure. We didn't know when we introduced Century to our school whether there was a difference to be made or not. However, when Helen talks to you about her experiences within her class, we saw a clear improvement in standards between those children who had regular engagement with Century and those who didn't. And we continue to see that. We're really, really pleased with how the children came back after lockdown and continue to thrive. And we actually are so privileged to have Century as part of that package of recovery. Can we fit into our curriculum? That's a big question that lots and lots of primary teachers ask, because there are a lot of demands on our time as primary teachers. However, Helen's going to talk to you about how we fit it in with the older children, but the fact that it focuses on the core curriculum, English, maths, science, and spelling and grammar, means that actually it's very, very easy to fit into the curriculum. It just is a matter of making sure that you are committed to continuing to use it really and continuing to refer to it as you go along. And the last one, does it fit into our vision for our school? Well, our vision for our school is something that we're really, really proud of. We want successful learners, children who are responsible and are able to be in control of their learning, and Century certainly helps that. It really is something that ties in with our vision for us now and our vision for our children as they move into the next stages of their education. So what did we do? Well, we put on a short but purposeful training for staff. Some of the staff really engaged with it and some of them didn't, because that's how it is, isn't it, within school environments. But actually, following that training, we set out a small exploration of sensory by the pupils and by the staff. We let staff find out the benefits for themselves, structured and nurtured by myself and Helen as the senior leaders within the school, so that staff could understand the benefits and really feel the benefits that sensory could have. We ensured that sensory was promoted and that children were praised for accessing it. We also enabled children who found that access hard, we gave them opportunities so that they were able to access it in class. We used it in the classroom, but also encouraged the use at home. There were a few cheerleaders amongst our parents who really engaged quickly, and we celebrated that support and made sure that that was shared across our school community. And we made sure that within the classroom, those technical difficulties that are sometimes a barrier to exploration were overcome quickly. And then we also made sure that we dropped it into our staff meetings and continued to talk about it. We kept it high on the agenda to ensure that we were really promoting the use of sensory across our core curriculum, and made sure that staff weren't allowed to forget about it. And that was really, really important in embedding it as a new strategy. So the next people we introduced it to were our governors. And if you're a school leader, there are some questions here that I'm sure that your governors will ask you. The first one, the expected impact. Well, we weren't sure about the expected impact to start with, but we knew what we wanted it to achieve. And what we wanted it to achieve was high standards for our pupils. And so we were able to challenge ourselves to be able to measure that impact. The fact that Nikki can produce all manner of spreadsheets and diagrams and really, really lovely pictures means that actually all of that evidence is there for us, and the governors can see the evidence without putting on additional workload for ourselves as senior leaders. So that's great, but also that impact when we use our internal data too. Can we afford it? Wow. That's a tricky one, isn't it? Because budgets are tight. But what we found was that the impact that sensory has upon teaching and learning far outweighs the cost. I'm sure that Tori and Nikki will be able to talk to you about that side of it. But when it comes to something that really does have a positive impact upon raising standards, then sensory definitely fits that bill. What will Ofsted say? Well, it's clear that sensory also fits in with the Ofsted agenda around raising standards. The knowledge-rich curriculum that Ofsted talks about is supported by the use of sensory within science, but also within the maths and English areas. There is a clear link between the sensory nuggets and a mastery approach to maths, and also very high standards of spelling, grammar and punctuation. All of these things are beneficial. Our children can talk about their learning, but they can also talk about how they learn and where they go for support. And that's really powerful evidence when it comes to Ofsted. And the final one is it sustainable? Well, as our school, we believe in sensory, so it's a really sustainable approach. It's something that we build into our budget planning so that we can afford it in the years to come, and we believe in as a tool to improve standards. It isn't something that can be just introduced for a year and taken away, in our opinion, because it's something that children are growing into and developing as we go along. So in that terms, it certainly is something that is sustainable. And we hope that the improvements we've seen in the platform in the short time that we've been working with sensory will continue in order to facilitate that improvement in driving standards in the years to come. So I'm going to hand over to Helen. She's going to have a chat to you about how we use sensory in our Year 5-6 classroom.
Hello all. So the way that we use Century across Key Stage 2 in Griffydam is slightly different in the 3-4 classroom to the 5-6 classroom. So in the 3-4 classroom, it's very much, we have an expectation that they'll follow their pathway and they have to do a certain amount, complete a certain amount of nuggets each week as their homework. And that way they're getting access to good quality mini lessons across the spectrum of spelling, punctuation, grammar, and maths and reading. But it also means that they're starting to learn how to use and access the different parts of Century and what Century can do for them, so that when it comes to my classroom, I can then start and focus the allocations according to their bespoke needs. And it really is about personalising their learning, rather than me setting a blanket nugget for everybody to learn about the active and passive voice. I'm able to just give that direction to the children that need to learn that specific aspect of grammar. And that's where it really ties in nicely with our internal assessments. So after an internal assessment, I'll complete a question level analysis, which allows me to see if there is a whole class issue with a certain strand or concept. And if not, then I can just pinpoint those children that need to go away and do those nuggets. And then so that will consolidate their knowledge, and then we can then boost them if we need to, if the nuggets aren't helping them. It also allows me, if there is a bit of pre-teaching that I need to do, for example, we're doing fractions, decimals and percentages at the minute. That is a very difficult concept, especially for the year 5s to be getting their heads around. So they'll often complete the nuggets before lessons, and that helps me with their pre-teaching. It's also an excellent section on times tables, and we have a heavy press on times tables in year 3 and 4. But if that isn't consolidated, then in 5-6, there's not often the time to teach times tables as discreetly across the year group. So it's really good for consolidation work as well. This morning, I've been doing mock SATs this week with my year 6s. So we completed the spelling test this morning. By break time, I'd marked them. My TA conducted the question level analysis, and it took me 10 minutes to assign nuggets to the children that needed nuggets on the different spelling patterns. So for me, now they have their own revision work, and we don't have to invest in those revision books, and everybody complete the same parts of the book. Because those higher achievers that don't need to be learning about suffixes ending in ly, they can be learning about the ent and ents endings if that's what they need. So for me, it's about me being able to pinpoint the actual gaps in my children's learning. What's also really good is my math homework. If I set that as a paper-based activity, I give them an array of different calculations across the 4 operations and across all of the different concepts. So it might be measure, it might be fractions. I then give them a list of nuggets that they can access for support if they can't fill out their own homework. That ensures that they are able to complete their homework, and I'm not seeing mum and dad's 4-column addition work. I'm seeing their own addition work. I think that's about me done. Oh, the improvements in internal data. So we've just recently done an autumn assessment at the beginning, baseline, autumn assessment at the end of autumn to compare. And my data for my spelling, punctuation and grammar, which is the one that we've really pushed this term as a trial, every single one of my children achieved that 100 scale score, and included in that I do have an SEND child that we didn't think up until year 5, he's now in year 6, would be sitting the SATs. So through the use of being able to access that good quality mini lessons at home and at school, it's allowed him to be able to access the SATs as well.
So you can see that our use of Century really does change as we go through Griffydam, from a very flexible, pathway-driven approach to that much more bespoke approach which prepares children to go to secondary and ready for their time as a much more independent learner. And the impact is clear. Our results really have surprised us, and actually in terms of recovery we feel in a really, really good position for our children moving forward. They are secure and happy and have got those skills of independence, and actually Century has been a really big part of that. So, but what are our next steps? Well, to continue to build on our offer for Century in terms of teaching and learning. We use it effectively at the moment, but the great thing about Century is that it really does continue to grow as a company, and we're really keen to access that to see how it impacts on pupil learning. And we are going to broaden our use of nuggets as a means to gap fill and to unpick misconceptions. It works brilliantly. But as you can tell from Helen, what Helen has said, the majority of our time has been spent over this term using it for our spelling and grammar, which was picked up as a school priority post lockdown. We really want to unpick the rest of the curriculum as in detail, and now the children are confident to use Century, we really have got that opportunity. And the last part is to further develop the use of the science strand in order to drive forward vocabulary and the knowledge element of science. 81, which primary practitioners will know as investigation, is something that primary schools teach really, really well. But actually, the depth of knowledge that is needed for science, particularly by the end of year 6, is vast. And so Century is a great tool to support that. And so actually enabling our staff to have the confidence to use Century as a support and a scaffold for our children is a really, really important development for us as a school.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Claire and Helen. That was so interesting. I really loved hearing about the student who's taking his SATs and when you thought he wouldn't. So it's love hearing stories like that. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you from those watching, and we'll move on to a Q&A shortly. But just before we do, I just wanted to explain a little bit about our support structure at Century and how that works. I won't spend too long here, it's just a brief overview, yeah, the way it works is that every school has a Century account manager who is your key point of contact for everything Century related from the beginning, and guides you through the implementation process and provides ongoing support throughout your subscription. When you're on board, when you come on board, your new account manager will be in touch to arrange an implementation call where we'll ask you lots of questions in order to get to know your school better and discuss your aims for Century. This is a really important part of the process as each school is unique and therefore has unique needs of Century. So our knowledge of the platform combined with your vision for what you want for it, we help you to come up with a plan that we know will work for your specific setup. So the next bit is that once we've got that initial plan decided, we'll then support you with launching with your staff by hosting a bespoke session that's tailored to your specific model of use, and that's usually delivered by your account manager and then a member of the curriculum team who are all ex-teachers and who also actually design a lot of the content, so you can answer all of your questions no matter how specific or in-depth they are. Once the staff training is complete, you'll then be ready to launch with your students. And we always recommend holding a launch lesson and an assembly, and we support you through that whole process. Our team works with hundreds of primary schools, and we've built up a huge amount of experience dealing with the unique challenges each school faces when it comes to bringing in new tech. So we're well versed in the best ways to approach it by now. So yeah, once things are off the ground, we'll check in regularly with usage reports that contain lots of interesting metrics, a little bit of which you saw at the beginning there. These are really useful little kind of snapshots just to see how engagement is going. And alongside those, we also provide specific advice tailored to what is in that report also usually. So again, just kind of getting that really personalised advice and insight. And yeah, that's something we do really kind of take pride in, is our personalised service here at Century. Every school we work with knows their account managers by name, and knows that they can speak to them whenever they need to get support or advice, and it really is the backbone of our support structure at Century. So that's the process really for coming on board with Century, and how the support system works in a nutshell. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to hand back over to Tori now for the Q&A. So get your questions ready if you have any. So over to you, Tori.
Thanks, Nikki. And thanks again to Claire and Helen. That was fascinating to hear about how you've been using Century, and I'm really pleased to hear that it's had such a positive impact on your students' learning, and especially those in the 5 and 6 class who are preparing for their SATs. So if it's okay with you, we'll move on to the Q&A part of our webinar. So if anyone has any questions, do feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. So Claire and Helen are obviously the real Century experts today, but if anybody has any questions for Nikki or myself, we're very happy to answer those as well. So we've got a question in the chat about home learning and how you encourage the students to do that extra learning at home.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely encourage children to use Century as their primary home learning tool here. So we set an amount of nuggets to do in lower key stage 2 to prepare children and to get them to get into the habit of using that. And then as you go up into upper key stage 2, Helen will describe what happens there.
So in upper key stage 2, I don't set a specific amount of nuggets. My nuggets come from what we do is if we are learning a specific thing in grammar, then and the children are struggling with that, then they will go away and complete those nuggets, and they're able to search out the specific things they need to learn. The same with maths or any of the other things. If I know something's coming up, I'll ask them to complete the nuggets on that, to pre-teach, and if they've struggled following the lesson, then ask them to go and complete a nugget to make sure that they're consolidating their learning. With regards encouragement at home, I think it's really, really important that you get parent buy-in. So maybe hold a parent evening, get them on it to see how it works, to see how the pathway is developed, so the children, once they've completed a nugget, if it flags up any other things, that will come up in their pathway, so that it's not just a case of complete the nugget, get 26% and then that's it. What happens then is it flags up other things for them to do on their pathway, and they can just continue their own bespoke journey. And I think that parent buy-in is the most important thing there. Our parents have really welcomed it, because especially a lot of parents are worried about how their children have felt after the COVID lockdowns. They're probably also feeling very insecure about their own, how effective they were as home teachers. But what the Century does is it gives them precise content that the children can access as a video, multiple choice questions with different answers, and maybe take 20 minutes a night, but it actually gives them the opportunity for some really good quality learning, rather than them trying to fumble their way through a grammar sheet that the parents have got to learn the grammar for in the first place, or learn the maths for how to deal with it. So parent buy-in, I think, is the best way to encourage home learning. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Karen. In fact, yeah, what are your parents' thoughts on Century was going to be the next question. So you've answered that wonderfully. So yeah, I'm really glad that that it's all working, because with something like Century, you do need buy-in from everybody. You need buy-in from SLT, from teachers, teaching assistants, students, and the parents. So glad to hear that it's all working well at Griffydam. So we've had another question here about how your approach has kind of changed over time. You mentioned about how you let your teachers kind of find out the benefits for themselves and kind of shape the way that they use it. So I just wondered, is it different? Is your usage now different to what you imagined right at the very beginning?
Yeah, it is actually. When we invested in Century, we really did think that it was something that was going to be used predominantly for home learning, and predominantly children would follow their own pathway. You know, because we could kind of see that as a way forward. However, the way that Century is used now is that it's an integral part of so much of our curriculum in Key Stage 2. It's used in the lessons, it's used for home learning. Helen has said it's used for pre-teaching, it's used for consolidation, and I think that that is really, really powerful. And actually it's great because we're using it in so much more than we've used it, we thought we would. And you know, from a cost perspective, we really are getting our money's worth out of that investment, and that's reflected in our standards. So yeah, it does change, and I think to be open to that change is really, really important.
Thanks, Claire. And another question, I suppose quite a broad one here, from Raj in the chat, is what advice would you give to other schools looking to implement Century or any other ed tech?
I think that you have to do what's right for your school. So initially we bought it for lockdown to help and aid our recovery and our home learning. So I was uploading tasks, scanning things in, uploading tasks, specific reading tasks and things like that I wanted them to learn, allocating nuggets as I wanted them to learn them. As lockdown ended, I had to really kind of think about how I was using Century and think about how that had to change now that the children were back in school. So to still make it cost effective and also the most meaningful learning experience for the children. So I think that my best advice would be, don't go in, if you purchase Century, don't go in with a tunnel vision that it's going to be for this reason. You have to really see how it works for your school. It really complements our internal monitoring. It really complements bespoke learning. But you have to be fluid with that. You have to be reflective. You have to find your own way with it. And I think it can be really meaningful for the children if you are approaching it with a really open mind and developing it and changing it and trying new things.
And the other bit to that is, if you are thinking about implementing Century, talk to a school where it's already in place. And there are lots of us around, and all of us use it slightly differently. You know, for me, it's been really, really interesting talking to secondary colleagues about how they use the Century platform and being able to have a think about how that might impact upon my thinking around the platform. So yeah, absolutely, that would be another bit of advice.
Thank you. Just was one more question on some of the courses. So a question on would reading be incorporated into Century? So we've got reading courses on the platform. So we've got a reading course for year 3 and 4 and a reading course for year 5 and 6. And just while I'm on courses, so we've got kind of full coverage across English, maths and science. So there is SPAG courses for each year group as well in English. In maths, we've got the maths courses for each year group. We've also got a multiplications tables course and an arithmetic course for 5, 6 as well. And then we've got year group science courses as well. And then there was another question which I might take on could Century replace Microsoft Teams? So the kind of short answer to that is it depends slightly how you use Microsoft Teams. If you're using it to set work for your students, then there is the capability to do that on Century. You can create your own tasks or share documents with students on Century, and you can mark them on the platform. But of course, if you're using Teams for any sort of live lessons while students are absent, then that would have to be a Teams thing. And one more question. This is back to you now, Claire and Helen. How have you found Century to close the gaps in numeracy and literacy?
We found it highly effective. Helen talked about the data, and we've noticed that across all areas, that actually the use of Century has really helped us in terms of our educational recovery. We're not worried about the spring term SATs that are coming up, because we know that the children are ready, and we put that down in part to our use of Century as a tool for filling those gaps. Yeah, it's been invaluable.
I think the main thing is, so long as you're conducting question level analysis, so you know the gaps that your children have, the specific gaps that your children have, it's incredibly effective, because parents want to do as much as they can to help their children, support their children for the SATs and things like that. So if you can give them a list of things that they need to do, then it is an incredibly effective tool, because it gives them high quality mini lessons where there's no room for misconceptions. It's very different to the books, the revision books we buy, where the children have to read and interpret it. It's very different because it's a video that they can watch, and it's reactive. They get anything wrong, it flags up in their pathway, and then they can try again. So that it's kind of very reactive to their own personal learning.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Helen and Claire. I think that brings our Q&A to a close now, and thanks as well to those of you who shared your questions. So hopefully this webinar has given you a good flavour of what Century is all about and the impact that it can have on students' learning. So if you'd like to find out more about Century, then you can visit the website. So it's www.century.tech. And if you do have any more questions, then please do drop us an email at info@century.tech. And so once again, thank you so much for joining us, and a massive thanks to our guests, Helen and Claire, and I hope you all have a lovely evening.